A global outcry has followed the beheading in Saudi Arabia of a young Sri Lankan housemaid accused of killing a child in her care. Saudi authorities are accused of restricting proper legal assistance to the victim. The plight of migrant workers in Saudi Arabia is causing concerns, and questions are being raised about what's being done to address it. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazm Seeker. The beheading in Saudi Arabia of a young Sri Lankan maid continues to stir anger in her home country and beyond. The case is also drawing widespread criticism despite repeated appeals to the Saudi government from Sri Lanka as well as rights groups. Sri Lanka has recalled its ambassador to Saudi Arabia after the execution of Rizana Nafeek over the death of an infant in her care in 2005. She was beheaded in the town of Dawadmi near the capital Riyadh on Wednesday morning after being sentenced to death in 2007. She was accused by her Saudi employer of killing his infant daughter while she was bottle feeding her. The case once again highlights the plight of thousands of migrant workers in Saudi Arabia. Human rights groups say access to adequate translation and legal assistance is limited or non-existent. Rights groups raise concerns about the fairness of the trial as Nafeek was denied access to legal representation and adequate translation. More now from Minel Fernandez in the Sri Lankan capital, Colombo.
A mother's anguish. Rizana's mother broke down when talking on the phone to this social worker who had supported the family throughout the case. The girl was 17 years old and had never been out of her village. In this, her first letter home, she writes how difficult she was finding the job.
It was work all the time for her, and lack of training in running a home. Because she's 17 years old, she has not had the experience of bottle feeding children. And she went as a housemaid but was given the task of feeding this baby.
Sri Lankan papers gave full coverage to the case. Numerous attempts to secure pardon during the 7 years since she was sentenced to death failed. Even this last-minute appeal from her family, filmed 3 days ago, came too late. And it's this shack that Rizana's family calls home, a home she had hopes of rebuilding.
It's poverty that pushed her into this situation. I'm sad for her as a fellow citizen that she had to face this end.
Broken dreams, disappointment and even death. Common factors for thousands of Sri Lankans like Rizana searching for a better life. For those left behind, nothing but heartache. Minel Fernandez, Al Jazeera, Colombo.
Well, the Sri Lankan government has condemned the girl's beheading. The Foreign Ministry in Colombo issued this statement. President Mahinda Rajapaksa made a personal appeal on 2 occasions immediately after the confirmation of the death sentence and a few days ago to stop the execution and grant pardon to Ms. Rizana. President Rajapaksa and the government of Sri Lanka deplore the execution of Ms. Rizana Nafeek despite all efforts at the highest level of the government. Well, let's talk more about this now with our guests. From New York, we have Nisha Varia, senior researcher in the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. Varia has worked on domestic workers' rights and published numerous reports on migrant workers across Asia and the Middle East. From Beirut, Caroline Nanzer, project manager at Caritas Migrant Center in Lebanon. And joining us on the phone from Colombo, Rajiva Ragasinga, member of the Sri Lankan Parliament and presidential advisor. He was also the former head of the Sri Lankan Peace Secretariat and the Secretariat to the Ministry of Human Rights. Good to have you all with us. Nisha Varia, I want to start with you. To what extent does this particular case then fit into a wider pattern of domestic workers and foreign workers in Saudi Arabia?
This tragic case is definitely just one of many problems and abuses that may fall upon domestic workers in Saudi Arabia. There are hundreds of thousands of Sri Lankan workers working as domestic workers in Saudi Arabia and in other countries in the Gulf. Many of them, like Risana, face problems during recruitment. Her documents were falsified to show that she was 23 when she was only 17. And we know that there are many other cases of deception or migrants being charged very high fees that leave them greatly in debt at the recruitment stage, which leaves them vulnerable to abuse once they migrate abroad. Once they are working in Saudi Arabia, they're not covered under the labor law, so they're not entitled to the same protections that other workers can take for granted, such as a day off once a week or limits to their working hours. Our research has found that many of these domestic workers may be working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week for months or years on end. Many of them are confined to the workplace, may not be getting enough food, and all of these conditions contribute to factors that can give rise to other forms of abuse, such as physical abuse and sexual abuse.
All right.
If a domestic...
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Continue what you're saying.
If a domestic worker comes into conflict with the law, such as Risana Nafik, she may not have access to a lawyer, she may not have access to a translator, she often doesn't know what her rights are. So either when domestic workers are victims or when they're being accused of a crime, it's very difficult for them to get fair treatment or due process in the Saudi judicial system.
All right, we'll talk a little bit more about what can be done about this and who is to blame for all of this. But let's get the view from Colombo then. Rajiva Ragasinghe joining us on the phone. First of all, what is your take on this particular case? Obviously, it's caused quite an outcry back in your country. Are you satisfied with the way your government has reacted to this? Could they have done more? Have they done enough?
Well, I think they did their best in a situation in which, unfortunately, it's very much on the side of the hiring country. And I think it's very important that, for instance, the various conventions on domestic work that the ILO, I think, finalized a couple of years back, 2011, I think we need to move towards universal acceptance of these. I think it's also especially important to move towards much greater protection to begin with, better training. We have in the last 2 or 3 years tried to develop this through much better training mechanisms, familiarization mechanisms, education about rights, plus better monitoring of people who go out. But I think you have had a situation where people, in a sense, slipped through the net. I mean, in this particular case, we had regular rules, but it looks like both the girl and the agent, falsified matters so that her age was given as much more than it was. And on the one hand, of course, we really need to have better structures. We're moving towards it, but you need international support for this as well. And second, you have to also bear in mind that because of what seems to be the economic attractions, even though everything the lady from Lebanon said was true about the possible risk and so on, people still choose to go out. And of course, the majority of stories that come back do not discourage them. Because although we need the conventions, because even one abuse is one abuse too many, there is also a situation where people do want to keep going for these jobs because the grass seems green at them.
Well, you say that the case of what happened with Risana Nafik, that she was somebody who slipped through the net. But from what I've read on this, there are dozens and dozens of cases just like this, and it's a little bit more than somebody just slipping through the net, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by dozens of cases. I don't think there are many cases of very young girls having birth certificates falsified. Is that what you meant? Do you think there are dozens and dozens of such?
Well, what I mean is that there are so many cases of this happening where employment papers have been falsified and so on. And the impression I get from what you've been saying is that this is really the exception rather than the rule.
Well, I think it is the exception rather than rule if you look at the numbers that go. But the very fact that it happens indicates that obviously I don't suppose this is the only case. I think, both you and I are talking in a vacuum. If you give me the instances you'd know, I think you'd find that we're not talking about massive numbers. But that is precisely why, as I said, in the last 3 years, we have been trying to develop much better protection mechanisms, indeed even certificate, as it were, from the Gramanildari, that's the local official, the village admin, as it were, so that you have as much information as possible before people go away. I've been trying to actually set up things like vulnerability indices, whereby the women and children's committees of the divisions would know exactly who's going and whether they've had the proper training. But you have to remember that Rizana, I think, went away something like 7 years ago.
All right, let's turn to Caroline Nanser then in Beirut. Where does this particular case rank, in your opinion, when you look at how this compares to some of the work that you've done where you are?
So the Caritas Lebanon migrant sector works specifically in Lebanon. However, it is true that even for Lebanon, you don't have or you haven't had for a very long time women migrant workers sentenced to death. You still have a lot of migrant workers who actually in the region suffer abuse and are sentenced for life. So this is not a specific case. If obviously this is one of the worst case scenario that could happen to Nafik, that we obviously very much regret. However, we would like also to stress that this is also linked to the sponsorship which is in place in the whole region, which is the kafala system. And this kafala system has been shown by many researches that this kafala systems actually ties the employer to the employee, and this kafala system is also the cause of the many abuses that the maid workers suffer here in the Middle East.
Nishavara, you were nodding in agreement earlier there to some of what you just heard. It appears that there's plenty of blame to go around. Where do you think it should start?
I think it should?
There are many reforms that would have to take place to protect domestic workers. In response to whether Risana's cake was isolated or whether the Sri Lankan government should do more, I do think both the Sri Lankan government and the Saudi government could be doing a lot more. Maybe she's only one person who was recruited at age 17 and then executed for a crime she did when she was that young. But there are thousands of Sri Lankan domestic workers who are complaining of non-payment of wages for months or years at a time, who have been suffering physical and sexual abuse. There have been very high-profile cases, for example, of Sri Lankan domestic workers who had nails hammered into them by their employers, real forms of torture. And the Sri Lankan government has really failed in its responsibility to provide support to its workers abroad. Its embassies have not had enough qualified personnel to respond to these complaints and to provide them shelter and legal aid. And as Caroline mentioned, there is a great responsibility with the governments that are employing these workers. Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Kuwait, many of the countries in the Middle East do not include domestic workers under their labor laws, and they do use this immigration sponsorship system, which gives employers incredible power over domestic workers. It means that a worker cannot leave her job without permission from her employer. If she leaves the home because she's suffering abuse, she may be treated as an immigration offender instead of somebody who needs help.
All right, let's get Mr. Weerasinghe's view on that. Shouldn't your governments like yours in Sri Lanka be doing more to educate workers about what they're getting into here, the rights and basically more knowledge about what could potentially happen to them?
The name is Weerasinghe, by the way. I know I don't expect perfection, but it would be nice if there was slightly greater effort. No, I mean, you're perfectly right. We have to do much more to educate, and this has been an ongoing process over the last 2 or 3 years. We've actually developed a ministry that has much better systems, but I think you can't ever be satisfied. You have to keep doing better and better in terms of educating these people, bearing in mind that very often they come from fairly poor backgrounds, and especially when you get young girls coming in, you can't do enough. I think the point the lady made before about the need for better systems in country is also the case. We've been trying to have a system developed of registering and recording. Unfortunately, as you're probably aware, you need quite a lot of personnel to do this, and we perhaps need to expand our numbers, which is not easy. I mean, as I kept saying earlier, you also have to remember that once they're in that country, having signed a contract, which may be a very unfair contract, they're at the mercy really of the conditions within that country. And as you know, Saudi Arabia is one of the few countries in the world that allows the execution of minors, which may seem horrible to us, but that is their law. And that is why I think it's particularly important that this convention be signed, because in a sense, for a country like Sri Lanka, which is exporting workers who want to go and work in such countries, however terrible some of the stories they hear, don't forget they also hear very good stories. I think it's very important to have international rules in place or conventions, and in particular, provision.
All right, but international rules and conventions are one thing, but actually enforcing those rules is something else, Mr. Wajasinha. One of the things I want to put to you is the fact that there are many domestic workers from Sri Lanka who are sent to countries like Saudi Arabia, countries in the Gulf, many of them as well from the Philippines, from elsewhere in South Asia. So there is an economic dependence there, certainly, and the suggestion has been made that there is also an unwillingness for many of the governments of these Asian countries that provide so many low-wage workers to bite the hand that feeds them, if I can put it that way. What do you say to that?
I don't think it's a question of biting the hands that feed them. You have to remember that when you said people are sent, it's not people are sent. People choose to go. There are actually queues of people applying for these sorts of jobs. And, it's very easy for you or me, who've never had the need to go to, do this, to understand the imperatives. But you don't use words like they're sent.
Well, you say people choose to go, but very often it's a dire economic choice that is almost forced on them.
And we started on that, and I said it's not perfect, with guidance in every respect. The second is develop, as the lady said from Lebanon before, better protection mechanisms and information mechanisms so that the workers can feel. Indeed, we must have an obligation where there's a reporting mechanism, and the agents and the sub-agents, who are very often the people who shift the rules a bit, have to be held more accountable. But the third area is that of the rules of the country concerned. And that is where I think you need international conventions. Now, I would be the first to say that the Philippines, which exports more workers, has much better systems of protection. Again, the Filipinos will tell you it's not ideal. People do suffer. But I think we need to start at least moving towards the levels they have had. And in the last 2 years, we really have been moving for that, in terms of having.
All right, well, we've been asking viewers to join this conversation as well. So let's pause for a moment just to share with you some of what's been posted on the Al Jazeera Facebook page regarding this topic. Matt says there should be a travel ban to Saudi Arabia. These maids are just modern-day slaves with no rights and are regularly scapegoated. Sarah argues Saudi Arabia is a country that practices Sharia law, and if you commit a crime, whether you're white, brown, native, non-native, you will receive a trial and then a punishment. Beatrice says housemaids have no rights in Saudi. Another Sri Lankan took poison after mistreatment and was hospitalized in Daman when she was denied travel back to her country. Muhammad Yusuf asks, is it the death sentence or the beheading itself which was the problem? obviously, people were quite shocked by the fact that Saudi Arabia in the 21st century is a country that still chooses to behead people as a form of execution. But there are a number of other countries in the world, of course, that still enforce the death penalty. But I want to turn back to this issue of the general mistreatment of domestic workers and foreign workers in countries like Saudi Arabia and throughout other countries in the Middle East. And Caroline Nanser, if I could turn back to you on this. What effect do you think does the sort of the naming and shaming of offenders do? I mean, this particular story, and I know you mentioned this earlier, is perhaps an extreme case, and it's one that garnered a lot of attention in the news media in the last couple of days. But does it really have any effect in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, such case actually enables to shed the light of how many millions of migrant workers actually live, in which condition they live in the Middle East. Because as I said, I mean, this is also, I mean, what happened to Nafik is also the consequence of a system that should be ended as soon as possible. And I mean, this is also, I mean, an opportunity actually to raise awareness among everyone in the society, including the authorities of the host country, but also the authorities of the country of origin as well. I mean, it enables civil society to shed light on such conditions, but also on the numerous abuses that women migrant workers live on a daily basis. For instance, the Caritas Lebanon migrant workers receives on a daily basis dozens of women who actually chose to come to Lebanon, however, who were not always aware of the conditions, who have sometimes also been lied to by the employment agency when they left the country. There are also, as you mentioned, like many economic factors, or like that are.
All right,
oh,
just in the minute or so that we've got left, I just want to give the last word to Nisha Varia on this. What effect do you think this particular case will have on bringing awareness of this problem? Because this case, as tragic as it is, unfortunately there have been others that have come before it. So what effect do you think it will have in the long run?
Well, it depends on the response. If the Sri Lankan government says this is the responsibility of the Saudi government, and if the Saudi government says this is the responsibility of the Sri Lankan government, nothing will change. Every government really has to take responsibility for what it can do to better protect these workers who are at high risk of abuse. There is a new convention adopted in 2011 on domestic workers. Neither Sri Lanka nor Saudi Arabia has adopted it. They should take action to do that. And so what I hope is that people can, while mourning the case of Rizana Nafik and her tragic fate, really look at the broader situation of domestic workers and the many reforms that have to take place in recruitment, in training, in labor laws, in immigration sponsorship laws, to really make sure that tragedies like this don't happen again.
All right, that's going to have to be the last word. Thank you to all of our guests from New York, Nisha Varia, from Beirut, Caroline Nanser, and joining us on the phone from Colombo, Rajiva Wijasanha. Before we go, we want to share some more of the many responses that we got on Thursday's Inside Story on female infanticide in India and the worrying fall in the number of women in the population there. It's got a lot of you talking. Marie Lynn says the millions of girls missing in India because of this practice are so very much a part of this story. Not only is it wrong, but it has practical consequences in the long run, like the mismatched gender statistics and all the problems that go along when areas have way more men than women in the population. Mei Ling says, I don't see how it is quite possible for the policymaker or educators to change people's mindset within a short period of time. The law banned the dowry system quite a while ago. It still exists because those parents are under pressure of the traditions, and the law is still relatively new to their generation. And Kimberly says, education is the tool that can help break the pattern of gender discrimination and bring change for women in developing countries. And that's it for this edition of Inside Story. Remember, if you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Hazem Sika. Join me 24 hours from now for our weekly look at events inside Syria. Until then, thanks for watching. The latest news is up next. Bye for now.